I'm your host, Karen Christensen, and with me today is Keith Grint, a leadership scholar who I've known and admired for quite a long time. And a few weeks ago, he told me that he had a new book out. I'm going to show it to people because he said, I'll send you a copy. And I had no idea quite what a massive thing it was, especially because the title is A Cartography of Resistance. Keith, what led you to start on, I assume this was a while ago, a book that now turns out to be so incredibly timely?
I think I've always been interested in power and resistance on a kind of personal and a academic and a political level. So it probably starts with my childhood. So my father was in the army, in the British
Mhm.
Army. So I've always had a kind of love-hate relationship with everything military, everything to do with authority, anything to do in a uniform or saluting, all those kinds of things. So I'm kind of so and I teach the military a lot now, so I'm kind of empathetic towards them, but I also have a significant amount of reserve about where they end up and what they end up doing when they end up doing stuff. Um, so it kind of starts with that childhood, and then at school, I got I was expelled from school for a whole lot of reasons that would require an entire new podcast. But I think that started me on a kind of on a professional journey of resistance. And
Oh, I see. This
so,
is
so then I
personal too.
I spent 9 years kind of recovering from that, trying to sort my life out. And then I did an open university degree, and then I decided that my job was just useless. So I needed to become better educated. So then I went to university full time. Then I did my doctorate, and then I started really in sociology of work, organizations, industrial organizations, bureaucracy, that kind of stuff. And then about probably 10 years after that, I kind of fell into the leadership mode, mainly
Mhm,
because there really wasn't anybody else in this country, at least, looking at leadership, and certainly not from a sociological perspective. There were some psychologists, but mainly they were
mhm.
American psychologists, not British. And then so my writing went into the leadership vein, and as it went into the leadership vein, I became more and more interested in how people resisted leadership and
Mhm, mhm.
whether we got the wrong end of the stick in quite a few perspectives. So then, after let me say about 8 9 years ago, I started a book on mutiny, which kind of enveloped these two
Oh,
issues about the military and resistance and leadership. And that was quite big, not as big as the one you've got your hands on at the moment. And at the end of the mutiny one, I thought, well, that I find that quite interesting. So maybe I should do a larger one, which is not just restricted to military organizations. It's not about how you resist a military organization. It's just how you resist. So that's really the origins of the book. It just kind of it spawned from a whole series of different things that just fell into place. And the more I looked
and
at it,
how
the more
long ago when did you start working on it?
um, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I would think, something like that.
I see, I see. And the Mutiny book? I'm so intrigued. Did you read the Mutiny on the Bounty series when you were a kid or something? I hadn't thought about
Uh,
mutinies for a long time.
I I
I don't know
I,
how
um,
common mutinies are.
I I I think I got into the mutiny stuff mainly because I mean, I've been teaching military for a long time, and a lot of my civilian academic colleagues would say, "Well, why do you need to teach leadership? All they do is shout at people, and they just comply." And I said, "You don't know how militaries work. They don't work like that at all. They very
Mhm,
rarely give conventional orders." And one of the reasons for that is because there's this thing behind them, this kind of industrial
mhm.
machinery which says you will comply or else. But the other reason is that actually lots of people are not necessarily against that kind of compliance mechanisms. So then I wanted to work out that. So there's something about the way that people always or quite often argue that one of the reasons we don't resist is because we can't.
Mhm.
And my approach has always been that that's never the case. As long as you're prepared to put up with the consequences of resistance, then nobody
Mhm.
can ever make you
Mhm.
do anything. And I've used that a lot
Mhm.
in my teaching for a long time.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Mhm.
history is full of people who said, you know, if you don't kill this person, I'm going to kill you. And they say, well, you can do what you like to me, but I'm not killing them. And then they get
Yeah.
killed. But if they're prepared to be
Mhm.
killed, then you can't do anything with them. And that's where so mutiny occurs in the most coercive organization we know of, which is the military at war,
Yeah.
when the subordinates decide not to fight anymore. And if there's enough of them and they're well organized, then
Mhm.
there's nothing the hierarchy can do about it. So that's where the mutiny stuff came in. And I thought that I'll just kind of extend that to thinking about, you know, why some people resist and why others don't in non-military organizations. And
Mhm.
that runs in the book from, you know, why did people resist the Romans to why did enslaved people resist or not? And in this case that we'll be talking about today, who was it in Germany who resisted the Nazis and who didn't, and
Mhm.
why did they and why didn't they? And then the same for the Dutch. So I mean,
Yeah.
we have quite a lot of there's quite a lot of work on the French resistance, and I'm using that for another book later on. But I wanted to concentrate on two less covered areas. So one is
Mhm.
the amount of resistance generated by Germans towards Hitler and the Nazis, and then the amount
Mhm.
of resistance generated by the Dutch, and also trying to work out, you know, why the Dutch was so had so little effect upon the German occupation compared to the French resistance. And I think what
Oh,
the book
yes, we
seeks
don't
to do
yes. Uh-huh.
is try to explain. So it wasn't really about the population. It was much more to do with, first of all, on the Dutch side, um, their their secret network was unearthed, uncovered, and destroyed by the Germans very, very early on. So they couldn't be resupplied by the British because all the networks were
Mhm.
compromised. So
Mhm.
whereas the French got something like 90% of all the arms that were ever dropped in occupied
Mhm.
Europe went to the French, almost nothing went to the Dutch because the Brits knew they would go straight into the German hands. So they were compromised from the very beginning. And also the kind of geography of the Netherlands is so different from France. France has got
I was
mountains,
wondering, yeah.
forests, and all
Yeah.
kinds of things where you can hide armies in the forest
Mhm.
and the mountains. But there aren't any mountains and there aren't any huge forests in Holland, in the Netherlands.
Right, so,
So,
really practical
yeah, really
differences.
practical stuff
Yeah.
about why you did it. And then the third thing I think is what
Mhm.
the Nazis had assumed really early on, especially after their experience with Poland, with the Polish resistance,
Uh-huh.
was that on the assumption that the Dutch were closer to the Germans than the Poles were, then
Mhm.
the Nazis would not need to be um, so officious, so brutal, so calculating, and so violent, because there would be enough on the Dutch side to support them. And indeed, there were significant numbers of Dutch people who were either already in National Socialist Party, the Dutch National
Mhm.
Socialist Party, or prepared to put up with the occupation. And there's probably that, there's something in there about the way that the Nazis started in Holland, and they started really incrementally, quite gently in some ways, and quite civilized in their approach in the first few months, on the assumption that the Dutch were brothers, as opposed to the Poles who weren't. So they kind of massacred
Mhm.
the Poles from day one, whereas they assumed they could get
Mhm.
on with the Dutch. And it wasn't really until you know, kind of 18 months into the war, when the war is suddenly not going very well for the Germans, and they decide that they need huge numbers of Dutch labor to go and work in the German factories, because
Mhm.
all the German men are now mobilized into the army. And at that point, when you get this huge swathe of men are now being removed from Netherlands and transported to Germany. These are the ones that are not volunteering, and there
Yes.
are quite a lot of
Yes.
volunteers. The ones that were compulsorily removed, all of a sudden they had a big reason to resist. So
Mhm.
up until
We
that
should
time, you can put up with it, but at this point, there's no point in putting up with it. You either go with it and go to Germany,
yeah.
or you resist.
This may be too simple, but I wanna remind American listeners that the war started in 1939. Um, so so we're going so when we dated, a lot of Americans, I grew up thinking the war started in 1941 with Pearl Harbor,
Right.
and I did
Yeah.
not. Yeah, we need to keep that in mind, that people in Europe were dealing with this long before America actually entered.
Yeah, I mean, that we all have our own little myths about the Second World War. Some of the myths are rooted in some of the material I'm talking about, is that the Dutch resistance never really damaged the German occupation very much.
Mhm,
So why would they do it? And partly is to construct this myth of resistance. So by the end of the war, you can say, "Well, we did our bit. We resisted the
yes,
Nazis."
yeah, yeah,
It was the same in France, exactly the same in France. So it's part of this myth that de Gaulle was involved in, about saying that, France was liberated by the French. Well, it wasn't. It was liberated
mhm,
on the points of bayonets by primarily American, British, Polish, and some French
mhm,
troops as well. So
mhm,
there's this myth construction, which is a really important part of
mhm,
trying to understand why resistance occurs, and how politicians in particular make the most of it at the end of the war. So if you're trying to think about resistance in terms of, well, this will never change the way the occupation is going, that is probably true. But we're not talking about the occupation, we're talking about post-occupation. How do you justify what you did during the war, and how do you generate some kind of valor, some kind of
mhm,
pride, some national pride in what happened, as opposed to, you know,
mhm,
simply complying? So I think there's a lot of, and then in the American version, the kind of myth is that it didn't really start until 41, and then once 41 is over, then it's over because the Americans are in. But in the
you're
first
right,
6
they've
months of
sailed
the war,
in.
the Americans in North Africa were really, really poor because they had no experience of fighting. So, I mean, you have to
Mhm,
learn to do this kind of stuff, and the myth is then constructed from the other side, from the Soviet side, that without the Soviet Union, there would never been a victory over the Nazis, which is true because
mhm,
the Soviets killed something like 75% of all German casualties were inflicted by
mhm,
the Soviet Union, but the Soviets couldn't do it on their own. It was a combination of the Soviets, the Americans, the Brits, the French, the Poles, and anybody else who's
mhm,
had enough. Plus, occasionally some internal resistance in
mhm,
Germany in particular, but not.
mhm,
I mean, the German resistance during the war is very minimal because by that time most of it has been removed. So about
uh-uh,
10,000 people have already been executed before the war even starts, and
mhm,
huge numbers are already in camps. So it's not as if that, you can't really measure the resistance in Germany during the war and say, well, there was more resistance elsewhere, because
mhm,
most of the members of the Communist Party and Social Democratic Party were either in prison or had left the country or were dead.
mhm, mhm, mhm. But what did it mean for ordinary people? And this is the question I think that many in the United States in particular are asking right now. What Who steps up? How do they step up? Um, and I was really intrigued by the 3 parts to your kind of assessment of these things: leadership, management, and command. Hadn't really thought of those distinctions.
Right.
How would those apply in these
So I
cases?
think we spend far too long worrying about leadership alone, as if that's the solution to the problem,
Mhm,
both for the occupiers and the resistance or whatever it happens to be. And I think I mean, leadership is a really important aspect, but the way that I define leadership is it's restricted really to a kind of collaborative, collective response, which is different from a management response. So management is about getting all the resources organized, getting all the logistics
mhm,
organized. And command, in the way that I talk about it, is really about the coercive aspects, especially when you're in a critical situation. So in resistance, you need to have all these 3 bits lined up. So you need the leadership to be able to motivate people to join up with the resistance to do something. But
mhm.
people can't do anything unless they have the resources. So, for example,
Yeah.
just about early 1944, the Dutch resistance almost, I think they had something like 300 guns between them. So there's about 10,000 members of the resistance, but 300 guns. They didn't have any. So this is a management problem about this. You can't organize resistance unless you've got the resources to go with it. And then the
Mhm,
command is about, how do you control all these diverse groups? Because both in France, Germany, and the Netherlands, there are really enemies who are only united against the occupier. So you have
Mhm.
in France and in Holland and in Germany, you have members of the Communist Party, you have members of the Social Democratic parties, you have trade
Yes.
unions. All of them dislike each other, don't trust each other, so they all form different kinds of resistance groups. And it's then up to the leadership to be able to get these people to collaborate and not to take unnecessary risks and not to start uprisings when you don't need an uprising. I mean, I think the French in particular learned from the Warsaw Uprising towards the end of the war was a catastrophe.
Mhm.
Thousands of Warsaw Polish partisans were killed because the Soviet army is camped outside Warsaw and didn't move. They could have moved in and
Mhm.
helped them, but they didn't. They waited until the Germans had destroyed most of the resistance movement, and then they moved in. So there's something
Intentionally?
here.
Did they know? Did they
Yeah,
know this was
no,
going
they
on?
did it intentionally. Yes, they did, because they were intent on taking over Poland at the end of the war.
Yeah, right.
And the
Yeah.
last thing you want is a group of people who have liberated themselves,
Right.
full of full of
Yes.
intellectuals
Abs
and awkward people. What you want is to get rid of all those people, and then you can take it over.
Yeah,
And I
right.
think this is a very common pattern, that when some kind of oppression occurs, one of the first targets, yeah, are the intellectuals, are the academics, and you can see that. You can see that in your country now. The assault
Mhm.
upon the universities is precisely according to the playbook. That what you do is you
Mhm.
have to target the people that are going to give you the most resistance very early on.
Mhm.
So you
Yeah.
take out those intellectuals, you take out the academics, you take out the universities, then you take out the young men, and you take out all
Mhm.
of those people. You take out all the communists, all the leftists, and then
Mhm.
eventually, in theory, you end up
A
with a massive
docile
a
population.
docile group
Yeah.
that are too frightened, or have no method of resisting. And that in itself, I think, comes back to an issue about, what counts as resistance. Because I think there's a kind of sometimes it's called the kind of romance of the bullet, an argument
Mhm.
that resistance is really about violent resistance, and that's the only resistance that counts. But actually, it's not at all. There are lots of examples where people take all kinds of forms of resistance, even in terms of simply non-compliance, simply not doing what you're told, from that area to much more useful forms of passive resistance. So, for example, in Netherlands and in France, there are good examples of women who went on buses along the coastline knitting, knitting to their place of work, knitting back to their home. And what they were actually knitting were the defense mechanisms that the Germans had laid out on the coastline. So you do kind of four plain
Oh.
stitches, then you drop a stitch, and a drop stitch was an armed dump, and then you do
Mhm.
four more plain, then you do a pearl stitch, and the pearl was a gun, and you do this
Mhm.
knitting the whole time. Then eventually you have the, the complete map of the defenses, which was vital for the Allies on D-Day,
Yeah.
because they knew where all the defenses were. And of course, were they to be stopped on the bus, and the German guard said, "What are you doing?" "I'm just knitting." And no German male is ever going to be able to read
Do
a knit pattern.
do we have any idea who came up with that idea?
No, I
It's
don't, but
brilliant.
it became quite common, and then there are other kinds of similar kinds of, non-violent, resistance. So there are women we know in Ravensbrück, in the camps, who were not employed since it was slave labor, but they were
Mm.
required to knit socks, and they would consciously knit extra knots in the ankle, in the foot, in the sole, so that you couldn't wear them for very long. And of course, it doesn't do a huge amount, but it means that these socks become useless over time. And then we have stories of German women in the concentration camps, German Jewish women in concentration camps, who would put into the fur coats that had been stolen from them, and then were going back to Berlin. They put a note in saying, "This coat once belonged to a Jewish woman." Just a little note like that, or they would undo some of the stitches so that the lining would come out. Yeah, really small, simple things. And I think in our heads we have this masculine bias towards resistance is violence. It's about guns and assassination and stuff. And it
Mhm,
is, but it's also about all kinds of ways that people could demonstrate resistance, and they would never get kind of medals for doing this kind of stuff. So,
mhm,
for example, about a quarter of the resistance fighters in France were women, but no more than about 3 or 4% ever got a medal at the end of the war for being in the resistance. Because
mhm.
resistance is a masculine topic, and
Yeah.
there are lots of examples of French resistance men monopolizing weapons because that
Mhm.
that was where the quote unquote glory came from.
Yeah.
That was the heroic stuff, as opposed to the, feeding people, giving them sandwiches, knitting socks, or whatever else they were doing.
Yeah. I'm really curious about it seemed to me with command that you have a problem of both communication and of a sort of structure, right? In the military, you have a hierarchy and a
Yeah,
system so that
yeah.
how on earth does that but it's very relevant to today. How do people set up both the communication and then some kind of agreed upon structure so things can work efficiently?
Yeah, I think this is a real problem for lots of resistance groups. So as a very brief example, one of the reasons, so Boudica, who's the kind of British Romanesque resistance leader, she has about 100,000 Britons fighting about 20,000 Romans, but they're completely uncoordinated. She has no
Mhm,
coercive control over them. It's just a mob, and the Romans are just a machine, a mechanized killing machine. So here you have a good example of you have all these resources, but they're
mhm.
useless against that kind of organization. So and
Yeah.
then that kind of reproduces itself in terms of the resistance in Germany. It's about this stuff has to be done clandestinely, and it has to be done in really small groups. And
Yeah.
it's not until right at the end of the war, when the Allies are already into Europe, and the resistance movements now agree that they can move from their very small clandestine groups that are engaged in really small efforts to undermine
Mhm,
or assassinate Germans, that they can begin to start thinking about how do they coordinate an uprising. And
mhm.
at that point, they do that only when the kind of coercive boot of the Nazis has started to lift, so that they have greater control over the communications.
But
And
presumably, they want to meet. I mean, do they is it on paper? I mean, then there's
no, no,
evidence.
no, no, they met in person in various places. They would send an individual leader.
Mhm,
So there are about 7 individual groups in France, for example. There are about 7 individual groups. Netherlands has about 5, and they send a leader from each group to a particular place to
mhm,
organize the uprising, when the uprising will be, and who will be in control. And of course, that's massively controversial because they're all fighting to be number one, and they're also all fighting for what happens afterwards. They're kind of lining themselves up for political control at the end, and they're only in both cases they only agree as long as the war continues. Once the war continues,
mhm,
then it all starts to fall apart. And that's in the
mhm,
French case, that's when de Gaulle comes in and says, "Right, that's it. The war is over. You're all demobilized." And he manages to do that
mhm,
very effectively. But it's a really interesting point towards the end in both the Netherlands and France. At what point do we coordinate this? So in the German case, um, either most of the mass resistance has gone before the war even starts. They're all dead or in prison, and so what you're left with is either really small groups like the White Rose Group. These are a group of basically religious students who are only 6 or 7 people of the main core, and because they knew each other and there were a couple of siblings involved,
mhm,
they could
mhm,
they could report to each other, but they could never really grow it. I mean, they tried to grow it. They tried to go to Hamburg and beyond. It
mhm,
never really took off because of
mhm.
this danger of being reported to the
Yeah.
Gestapo. So it was a
Right.
really hard mechanism, and I think if the control is so great, that really explains why it was so hard in Germany to organize mass resistance, because the mechanisms of totalitarian control are enormous. Although, again, if you think about the Gestapo, there are only about, I think it was about 36,000 members of the Gestapo for over 60 million Germans. So, so
Mhm.
the portion of Gestapo officers to German civilians means they couldn't possibly control them, but they
Mhm.
had lots of people like neighborhood officials who would report on neighbors. They encouraged
So,
children to
like
report.
China is, the
Yeah,
neighborhood community,
yeah, all those
yeah,
mechanisms are then
organizing.
deployed. I mean, there was a point really early on in the war when the Gestapo is asks people to report on their neighbors, and they are flooded with so many reports, most of which are about just attempts of just personal retribution. They've got nothing to do with politics. They're just, I don't like this person. But there are so many reports coming
Absolutely.
in.
Yeah.
So many reports coming in that the Gestapo have to put an official notice out, please, saying, please stop reporting your neighbors. We are flooding this. Stop doing it. So they have
Yeah.
to roll back on that. But it's still very
That
effective.
that has come up in the States because there's a new legislation that was passed that allows the government to deport anyone who is um, is not here and legally, if they're stopped for a crime, not charged with a crime, so not necessarily arrested, but they can therefore so they it's let alone convicted because that means that neighbors could report someone. All they would have to do is call the police and say, "You need to check on this guy," and that person or that family, and then that family could be legally checked on and thus deported. I mean, it's
Yeah,
the potential for just personal retribution there is
yeah. I mean, the other
enormous,
element
yeah.
of that is this notion of the way that power actually works. So there are lots of examples of people that read the official Nazi paper, for example, going to work, but we know they didn't actually read it. They just had to carry a copy to pretend to be
Uh-huh,
volatile members of the
mhm,
Nazi Party. So there are all these people reading copies of the Nazi paper, but nobody knows whether they actually mean it or not because it looks like they're members. Then everybody assumes that
yeah,
everybody else is actually supportive of this.
yes,
Victor Havel has a thing in his he talks about in Czechoslovakia under the Soviet Union about the way that a shopkeeper has this sign in his window, and the sign says, "Workers of the world unite." And when you get to know the shopkeeper, you know he doesn't believe in this. This is just propaganda. Nobody
mhm,
believes it because everybody has a sign in the window. Everybody thinks, well, everybody must believe in it then, and that mechanism squashes a huge amount of resistance because everybody feels they're isolated, they're on their own, and they don't do anything. And when you look, why are you looking at me? Are you looking at me because you're going to get me deported, or are
yeah.
you looking at me because you want to know whether I'm actually supportive of you? It's this kind of conspiratorial nonsense and undermines a lot of attempts to organize resistance.
So who rises? Who becomes the leaders or even the managers in this, you know?
We know that there's never more than probably 5% in any population that are
Mhm,
ever overtly involved in any kind of resistance that I've looked at.
mhm,
And certainly at the beginning, and most of these are they're either politically motivated, or they have some kind of religious motivation, or they have some kind of personal motivation. So you took my wife away 2 months ago, and now I'm on a personal revenge attack, or I've been a member of the Communist Party or the Socialist Party or whatever,
mhm,
or a trade union official, or this is against my religion. All that, so you get a small number of these people who are driven, and they're really unusual. They're really unusual risk takers. You also get, and this is kind of interesting, a lot of immigrants are involved, directly involved. So in the French case, some of the most
uh-huh,
effective early resistors were Algerians. They weren't actually French. They were French Algerians,
Mhm.
and they
Mhm.
were directly involved. So there is something about this, not being part of the mainstream, being kind of liminal, a liminal character
Yeah.
who sits
Mhm.
outside, doesn't have that huge body, doesn't have this massive family network. Because the
Mhm.
deal is, if you do something wrong, all of your family will be deported
That
or imprisoned.
vulnerability, yeah, that vulnerability, yeah,
Yeah. Well,
that
so
that is
those young men and women who didn't have that because they were abroad
Mhm.
as far as they were concerned,
Mhm.
are
Yeah,
are much more willing and free to take, and also they're young. And, that
yeah.
it's, I remember looking at a report from an American, Air Force general came over to Britain in about 42, and he's looking around an American Air Force base, and he cannot understand why all the pilots are about 30 years old. And he's absolutely livid that we've got all these old men involved. And he says, all these men have got families. I want
Mhm.
Give me some young men, give me some 18, some 20-year-olds who have
Mhm.
got no relationships and don't know what fear is. That's what we
Mhm.
need. Those people
Yeah.
who are, not experienced in life and who are risk takers. And I think those are the same kinds of people. If you look at the French and the Dutch, many of them are really young people
Really
who,
young, yeah, yeah,
yeah, who
without
have
this same ties, yeah, but the
no
fearless
ties.
and that
Absolutely.
sense of,
Yeah.
immortality,
Absolutely,
um,
you don't know just how difficult this is, and you
right.
think you're lucky, you'll get away with it.
I was thinking about this, though, in popular culture, there are also the characters who are the unlikely leaders. I was thinking about both Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. You get these characters, sort of very fringe, small town, small time, and they rise. Does that ever happen in real life?
Yeah, I think so. I think lots of the resistance leaders were people that just found themselves in a position, got involved early on, and then, of course, a lot of their comrades get killed or imprisoned,
Mhm,
and they're the ones left standing. So they become the de facto leaders, not because they're selected as the best, they just happen to be still alive. And so you get a kind of combination. You get political leaders, which tend
mhm,
to come from a different generation. They tend to be pre-war political leaders, and they're
mhm,
hovering in the background and waiting to take over. And then you get the kind of military or resistance leaders who are much younger. They've got the occupying, in the case that we're looking at, the Germans don't know who they are, because if they knew who they were, they'd take them away. So that notion of, being unknown and invincible and young and yet experienced
mhm,
generates this group of people that do become significant leaders. Of course, many of them die out or get imprisoned or whatever it happens to be, and then you get other people that replace them.
mhm,
The other aspect of it is it's so decentralized early on that
mhm,
there are loads of leaders in various places. Every town has its own little group, and there could be
mhm,
just two or three people. So,
mhm,
basically everybody is a leader at this point, and you just
mhm,
take it upon yourself to do what you think.
and there's a
It
sort of momentum there, I suppose,
Yeah, yeah.
once they're in it. Um, I wanted to ask you, Keith, about the idea of I mean, at the moment in the States, when we say resistance, we're talking about resistance to the, developing authoritarian and government in this country, and it's a sort of positive thing. Very disorganized, very uncertain, but definitely a resistance to what we see as evil and the wrong direction for America and, in fact, un-American. But a lot of resistance movements, I mean, could we see the MAGA thing as a resistance movement? Certainly, the Ku Klux Klan was a resistance movement where the Nazis are, reclaiming former glory.
Yes, I mean, there are two aspects of this. One is the issue that resistance doesn't have a political color. It can be from anything. Any group can be a resistance, and quite often they are the most brutal organizations you could ever think about. So they're not necessarily libertarians or liberals or anything else.
Yeah.
So Yes, that also comes into play when we think about how do they resist being spied upon, and that is about decentralized control, about having no overt leadership, or about the leadership being covert and no one quite knowing, like like Klan, for example,
Yeah,
wearing hoods so that nobody knew
yeah.
who they were. So it's that kind of notion of the resistance. So I think it's a major error to assume that resistance movements are always against right-wing organizations. They're not. They can be against all kinds of organizations. They can be all kinds of things. The other aspect that you mentioned is the kind of the shame narrative. I think this is a really important point in trying to explain why some people end up. So, I mean, the Nazi Party in the beginning is a resistance movement against
Mhm,
what they believe to be the shame of the First World War. So they believe themselves to be undercut by the Social Democratic Party, and for them, the Jews who had allegedly financed the Social Democrats, which of course is nonsense. But they were extraordinarily resistant, and they are rooted in well, two things really. One is massive levels of inflation in post-war Germany, post First
mhm,
World War, and also the shame of losing the war, especially against the
mhm,
French. And I think you can see how that issue of shame and loss, and that kind of the romance of the period now lost to us. I mean, in the olden days, we used to be great.
mhm.
I mean, in my country, that becomes the kind of the British Empire nonsense that you see from
Yeah,
the
yeah.
reform, which is rooted in the days of old, everybody could leave your doors open. There was never any crime.
The
If anybody
sun never set on the
all that
British
kind of stuff.
Empire,
It's
yeah.
like I remember my mother was, a teenager during the war years, and she always used to talk about, how she loved the war because she had all these, gorgeous American soldiers came over, and they had dances every weekend, and it was
Mhm.
fabulous. There was no crime, and everybody was safe, and everybody was putting together, and I said, "But last week, Mum, you told me about always carrying a 6-inch hat pin with you just in case you got assaulted." I says, "Oh, yeah, 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 I've forgotten about that." So there's something in there about, our romantic interpretation of the past undermines a lot of what actually happened. But I think that shaming
Yeah.
thing, that notion that, at some point in the past, we were a fantastic group, organization, individual, nation, and something has happened, and the only way to get it back is to do this. Now, I mean that the idea that for example, in your country, the idea that the tariffs would somehow bring back all those manufacturing jobs, frankly, is nonsense. But it serves this kind of romantic
Yes,
nostalgia that if we just did
but it
this,
is
we would get back.
nostalgia, isn't
It
it?
is.
And
Yeah.
and the idea that somehow other people have taken it away from us.
Yeah, and then the
The
question is,
great,
well, if you've taken it away,
the
who was
glorious
benefited
past.
who has benefited from all these jobs that have been taken away? Why aren't we looking at those kinds of people? Why are we looking at the people that don't have the jobs? Surely we should be looking at the fact that there's something wrong with the tax system, which implies that, all of a sudden we have these hundreds of billionaires that are, quite happy to go into space for 10 minutes, and they could solve poverty, world poverty overnight if they chose to, but they don't. And I think this is something which relates to a different paper that I wrote a few months ago,
Mm,
which is contrasting between the mundane and the extraordinary. So, I mean, the mundane stuff is like, um, what we should be doing is making sure that nobody starves to death in our countries. That's really mundane. Nobody will
mhm.
go down in history as the person that saved all these people because nobody will know about it. No, the best thing to do if you've got lots of
Mhm.
money is to spend it on a spaceship, and everybody will see you on the news. And the fact that all these people are starving to death is completely irrelevant. So the mundane issues, which really need to be sorted, are ignored for the extraordinary issues, which we always focus on. So if I'm in charge of, I don't know if the last time you came to the country is probably a couple of years ago, our roads are
Yeah.
absolutely full of potholes. There's massive numbers of potholes everywhere. But but we
Oh, wow,
don't
that's
we
like
don't
us.
we don't we don't spend millions of pounds fixing potholes. What we do is we spend billions of pounds on a railway system that will increase the speed from London to Birmingham by about 10 minutes, which is completely irrelevant to most people. but that's where you get the glory from. The glory comes from the big extravagant stuff, not from the mundane stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that feeds into this resistance issue, is that we focus on the extraordinary things. We don't focus on the mundane stuff that everybody could get involved with, is simply not complying. If we all, it's like the
Mhm.
university. I see that Harvard has now basically said we're not complying, but many other
Yeah.
universities have already said yes, we are complying. Now, if they collectively said
Yeah.
we are collectively not complying, that makes for a much stronger resistance movement than just picking off. Just, I mean, it's the ability of Harvard to be able to resist because they're extraordinarily wealthy. And some universities couldn't do that, but they could if they all did it collectively,
Mhm.
but they choose not to. And of
Yes.
course, what the
Yeah.
authorities do is just pick out individuals and go for them one by one. This is this is classic
And the same thing
dictatorial
with the
policy.
law firms. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what kind of organizing? I was really intrigued. I must make make sure we talk a little bit about this because your last section of the book is about rhetoric, about communication, basically. And I wonder what advice you have for, you know, coordinating and finding a common message, for anyone. What in the state, obviously, I'm focused on the states, but there are challenges in many places of various kinds.
Yeah. I think we know that people's you don't change people's minds by laying out lots of data or facts. People are not persuaded by that. They're
Mhm.
persuaded by
Mhm.
narratives of some form, and that also implies that when you're trying to counter propaganda or disinformation, there isn't any point in saying that's a lie and here's all the data because well, we don't believe your data, or that's a lie too. So you get into this position where um, rational scientists are trying to revoke, remove, and rebuff um, people who are just rooted in disinformation. There's th- there's an argument. It comes out of the Second World War. There's a guy called Sefton Delmer, who's born in Berlin, but to British parents in the 1930s. So he has a perfect German accent. And
Mhm.
when he comes back to Britain for during the war, he's expelled with his parents. He's then recruited into a resistance radio network, and London is full of resistance radios. They're all putting out information saying, "Do you know
Uh-huh.
what's happening in Poland? Do you know what's happening in Russia? Do you know what's happening?" Everybody knows what's happening in these places. So this resistance radio is basically useless. But he says, well, we're going about it the wrong way. You can't rebuff propaganda with counter propaganda. You have to be able to do it
Uh-huh.
the other side. So what he does, he pretends to be a senior naval officer. So his radio broadcasts are always things like. So I was walking down the Kurfürsten Dam the other day, and I heard two very senior Gestapo officers talking about several cases of champagne that they had stolen from the Reich, and how they were going to have a party. This is absolutely outrageous. This is corruption at the highest level. I mean, we all want to ensure that the Germans win the war, but we can't do it when we've got all these corrupt the Gestapo officials at the heart of our society. We must root these people out. And by the end of the war, he has much more impact than all the other usual counter propaganda people. So, I mean, and the other example would be to say things like, someone says to you, that the landings on the moon were false. You know that, don't you? Your response should not be, "Well, here's all the data suggests it's true." Your
Mhm.
response should
Mhm.
be, "You don't actually believe there's a moon, do you?" It's just, it's taken at a different level. It's
Yeah.
not trying to
Yeah.
argue with them, it's trying to undermine
Yeah.
them from inside, and I think we
Yeah.
need to be able to get to that point with all kinds of nonsense that comes out,
Mm.
frankly, of your government, is not
Yeah.
to try to rebuff it with data, 'cause they're not interested in data, and anyway, the story changes every day, so there's no
Yes.
point in doing it like that. You have to be able to do it on the day, and it has to be a really different thing. That also needs to be built into some kind of strong collective counter narrative. There's a
Yeah.
nice example in the Second World War, very early
Mhm.
on. There's a so-called V for Victory campaign, which is associated with Winston Churchill when he does his famous
Mhm.
V for victory. That is, it
Yeah.
wasn't his idea. It was actually the idea of a Belgian politician, and so he talks about drawing V's all over occupied Europe, and
Mhm.
so all these V's start to appear, and of course the Germans can't punish anybody because nobody knows who's doing it, and then it
Yeah.
becomes clear that if you have the Morse code for V is da 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 da, three dots and a dash, which is the opening
Mhm.
lines to Beethoven's Fifth. So now
Right.
everybody's going around Europe and they're whistling the opening lines to Beethoven's Fifth. They go,
I haven't
this is
heard that.
this is a really minor but an increasingly important aspect of resistance because it really winds the
Mhm.
Germans up. And they say, "How dare you whistle this resistance?" It's just it's one of your people. He's German. I'm
Yes, yeah.
German.
Great
It's
German composer.
and I think you need to be, you have to be able to construct these kind of counter narratives and counter symbols, and to be able to to undermine what's happening. And the other aspect of that, I think, is that when you look at the history of the resistance in Europe, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes years to get this sorted out, and then by the end of it, it
Mhm.
becomes really important. But you cannot do it overnight. You have to be able to get these resistors to gel. There has to be some
Uh-huh.
overview, some common narrative, which is not party political. It's just, in your case,
Yeah.
this is un-American. That's probably the best counter narrative,
Yeah.
that what's happening is un-American.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, it's been said for years, and I think it's true that for some reason the Republicans and the right wing has simply been better at messaging. They have some of the messaging gurus have been from that side of the political spectrum, and the Democrats are struggling with that, and frankly, the MAGA, the Make America Great Again, is a great, emotionally great slogan for America,
Yeah,
and we
yeah, this
even
is
though it's ridiculous, it's in
yeah,
factual terms, on an emotional level,
yeah.
it works, so we need something different.
This is the
Um
same as the whole Brexit debate is premised on exactly the same premise, that what you have is
Mm,
the Remain campaign is, "Look at all these financial benefits of staying in Europe. Look at all these numbers. Look at all these trade
mm,
figures." And the Brexit people are saying, "We want our country back. Reinforce the borders. Send immigrants home." They're 2 or 3
make
word slogans.
Britain great.
Yeah, it
It
was.
was make
It's
it
it
was
is
make
so
Britain great again,
it's
right?
so simple and so emotional, and you don't need to think
Yeah,
about the numbers. It's just, "Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah, that would be great." And I think the Remainers and the Democrats in this case have both lost themselves in the rational arguments that numbers count, and numbers don't count. Now, what counts is narrative, what counts is stories, what counts is,
yeah, yeah,
I hate to put it, but what counts as kind of heroes again. And it's that
mm,
notion of you have to be able to generate this kind of response which encourages people but doesn't expose them to harm, but basically makes
mhm,
it clear. So I remember when I was a teenager, I was about 18 going on a protest march against the apartheid system in London.
mhm,
And I came back and my mother said, "Where have you been?" I said, "I've been in an anti-apartheid march." She said, "Well, I don't know why you do that, because South Africa will never collapse because you marching around London." And I said, "I know it won't, but at least I'm stopping our government from saying nobody cares about apartheid." And I think that's the thing to
mhm,
do, is you undermine the notion that there's a consensus here, that everybody agrees with this,
mhm,
because you don't. And unless you engage in that kind of resistance, then those in authority can say, "Well, I don't see any resistance."
yeah. That is an important message, and one this is a conversation that, well, we're all gonna be watching what happens because obviously what's happening here is having an effect elsewhere. Um, and I'm getting ready to go to China, so we'll see what, comes of that too. I'll catch up with you next time I'm in London, but thank you very much for talking to me, and
You're
I
very
think
well.
this is it's just a fascinating book, and boy, do you have good timing.
Thanks,
Alright.
Karen.
Thanks a lot, Keith. Take care.
Bye.